Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. What I'm about to tell you completely destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my family. It started with an unexpected visit on a Saturday morning, and ended with me discovering that 9 years of my life had been built on a lie. This is the story of how one afternoon changed everything, and how a DNA test revealed a betrayal I never saw coming. My name is James, and for 9 years, I believed I was living the dream. I was married to Danielle, a woman I thought was my perfect match. We'd been together for over 9 years, and I genuinely believed we had one of those marriages people envied. Danielle was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed to share my values about family and commitment. When our son was born, I felt like my life was complete. I was determined to be the kind of father and husband I'd always wanted to be. I worked hard to provide for my family, putting in long hours and taking on extra projects to make sure Danielle and our son had everything they needed. But I wasn't one of those guys who thought providing money was enough. I made it a point to be present in our son's life. I attended every school event I could manage and spent my weekends building forts in the backyard. Danielle often told me how grateful she was to have a husband who actually showed up, not just financially, but emotionally. Danielle's friends constantly reinforced this narrative. At certain times, I'd overhear them telling her how lucky she was. They'd complain about their own husbands who worked late, forgot anniversaries, or couldn't be bothered to attend their kids' activities. Danielle would smile and tell them she knew how good she had it. I was proud to be the husband that other women wished they had. I was proud to be the father who never missed bedtime stories, who remembered every important date, and who genuinely enjoyed spending time with his family. When people asked me about work-life balance, I'd tell them that my family was my priority, and everything else came second. Danielle was particularly close to her friends, women she'd known for years who came to our house regularly. There was Anna, who was married to a lawyer. There was Beverly, whose husband, Robert, traveled constantly for work. And there was Barbara. Barbara had been part of Danielle's circle for several years. She was always friendly to me. She and Danielle would spend hours talking about books, sharing recipes, and planning group outings. At some point, Barbara's marriage began to fall apart. Danielle would come home and tell me about how Barbara was struggling with her husband's increasingly problematic behavior. The divorce process was messy and drawn out. Danielle spent a lot of time being a supportive friend, taking Barbara out for coffee when she needed to vent and inviting her over for dinner so she wouldn't have to eat alone all the time. I felt sorry for Barbara during that time. She seemed genuinely devastated by the end of her marriage, and I could see how much Danielle's friendship meant to her. When she'd come over for dinner, she'd often get emotional talking about starting over and worrying about how the divorce was affecting her situation. Danielle would encourage her, telling her she was strong enough to build a better life for herself. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that emotional vulnerability was genuine and how much was calculated. But at the time, I saw Barbara as someone who was going through the worst period of her life and needed the support of good friends. I never questioned her motives for spending so much time at our house, or why she seemed so interested in the details of my work schedule and weekend plans. It was a Saturday morning when everything changed. Danielle had gotten up early to make a list of errands she needed to run. She wanted to grab something from a store and mentioned she might stop by other places afterward. I was looking forward to a quiet morning with our child, who had been working on an elaborate project for weeks. After Danielle left around early that morning, my son and I were working on his project when I heard someone walking up the front steps. I wasn't expecting Danielle back, yet since she'd said she'd probably be gone for a while. The doorbell rang, and I walked to the front window to see who it was. Barbara was standing on our front porch, and she was dressed differently than I was used to seeing her. Instead of her usual casual weekend outfit, she was wearing something that seemed more dressy than appropriate for a Saturday morning visit. Her hair was styled, and she was wearing more makeup than usual. At the time, I just figured she had plans later and was making a quick stop to see Danielle. I opened the door and greeted her normally. She smiled and asked if Danielle was home, which struck me as odd since Danielle's car wasn't in the driveway. I told her that Danielle had gone out to run errands and probably wouldn't be back for a while. That's when Barbara said something that should have been a red flag. She told me she knew Danielle wasn't home because she'd called her before coming over, but she wanted to wait for her anyway. She said she really needed to talk to someone and didn't want to be alone. At the time, I thought this was just Barbara being vulnerable about her divorce and needing the support of a good friend. I'd seen how much Danielle's friendship meant to her over the past few months, and I figured she was having a particularly difficult day. The fact that she'd driven over knowing Danielle wasn't home seemed to confirm that she was really struggling and needed emotional support. I invited her in, just like I'd done many times before when Danielle's friend stopped by. My son was still working on his project, and everything felt completely normal and routine. Barbara and I went into the living room, and she sat down in the chair by the window where she usually sat when she came over. I took my usual spot on the couch, and we started making casual conversation. I asked how she was doing with everything that had been going on, and she said it was both a relief and terrifying to be starting over. She asked about my work, and I told her about a project I was working on. For about 20 minutes, everything was exactly like it had been every other time Barbara had visited our house. We talked about typical weekend stuff, mutual acquaintances, and normal things. The only thing that seemed slightly different was how she kept looking around the room, like she was taking inventory of our family photos, the comfortable furniture Danielle had carefully chosen, the little details that made our house a home. But people do that when they're in familiar spaces, so I didn't think much of it. My son came into the living room briefly to say hi to Barbara. She was always sweet to him, and today was no different. After a few minutes, he headed back to his room, probably to continue with his activities. That's when the entire atmosphere in the room changed. Barbara got quiet and stopped responding to my attempts at small talk. She sat back in her chair and looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. It was like she was studying me, evaluating something about me that I wasn't aware of. Then she stood up from her chair slowly, and I figured she might be getting restless or needed something. I started to ask if she needed anything, but before I could finish the sentence, she walked directly over to where I was sitting on the couch. Without saying a word, Barbara sat down right next to me. Not at the other end of the couch, where there was plenty of space, but close enough that our legs were touching. I could smell her perfume, something stronger than what she usually wore. Then, as casually as if she were reaching for a magazine, she placed her hand on my lap. My brain completely shut down. I'm talking about that kind of shock where time seems to stop and you can't process what's happening in real time. Here was my wife's close friend, someone I'd known for years, someone who'd eaten countless dinners at our table, sitting in my living room with her hand on my lap while my wife was out running errands and my son was in his room. I stared at her hand like it was a foreign object I'd never seen before. My mind was racing through every possible explanation. Maybe this was some kind of test? Was she having some kind of emotional breakdown and wasn't thinking clearly? But even as I was trying to rationalize what was happening, I knew exactly what this was, and it terrified me. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Finally, I snapped out of my mental paralysis and looked Barbara directly in the face. I asked her what she was doing, trying to keep my voice steady and quiet. Barbara looked me straight in the eye and asked if I didn't find her attractive. The question hit me like a physical blow to the chest. There was no room for misinterpretation anymore. No way to pretend this was anything other than what it obviously was. Barbara was making a move on me in my own living room, with my son in the house and my wife expected home later. Before I could respond, she moved even closer to me on the couch. She started talking in a low voice about how lonely she'd been since her marriage ended. She said she'd been thinking about me, that she'd developed feelings for me that she couldn't ignore anymore. She told me she'd been waiting for the right opportunity when we could be alone together. I was sitting there listening to this woman, who Danielle trusted completely, who had been part of our inner circle for years, telling me she'd been planning this. The betrayal of Danielle's friendship was almost as shocking as the proposition itself. This wasn't some spontaneous moment of loneliness or poor judgment. This was calculated. I stood up abruptly and told her she needed to leave immediately. I kept my voice low but firm. The transformation in Barbara's face was instant and chilling. The vulnerable, desperate woman disappeared completely, replaced by something cold and vicious. She stood up slowly, smoothing down her outfit, and picked up her purse. I thought she was going to leave quietly, maybe even apologize for putting me in such an uncomfortable position. Instead, as she walked toward the front door, she turned back to face me with a look of pure malice. She told me I was stupidly faithful to a prostitute of a wife and too naive to realize I was raising another man's child. Then she walked out of my house, leaving me standing in my living room with my entire world collapsing around me. I stood in that living room for a long time after Barbara left, trying to process what had just happened and what she'd said. My first instinct was anger. How dare she come into my home and disrespect my wife like that? How dare she make those vicious accusations just because I'd rejected her advances? But even as I was working up righteous indignation, a small voice in the back of my mind was asking uncomfortable questions. Why would Barbara say something so specific and cruel, unless she knew something I didn't? Why would she risk destroying her friendship with Danielle by making such serious accusations? I tried to push those thoughts away and focus on the immediate situation. My son was still in his room, completely unaware of what had just happened. Danielle would be home soon, and I needed to decide whether to tell her about Barbara's visit. Part of me wanted to call Danielle immediately and warn her about what kind of friend Barbara really was. But something held me back. Maybe it was the specificity of Barbara's accusations, or maybe it was the confident way she delivered them, like she was revealing information rather than making wild guesses. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to know for certain whether there was any truth to what she'd said before I confronted Danielle. When Danielle came home later that afternoon, loaded down with bags, I acted as normally as I could manage. She asked how my morning had been, and I told her our son and I had worked on his project. She seemed pleased and relaxed, telling me about her successful errands. That evening, I found myself studying Danielle and my son with new eyes. My son had always looked more like Danielle than me, which I'd never questioned since genetics can be unpredictable. But now I was noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. His features seemed to favor neither of us particularly strongly. I felt sick thinking this way about my own son, but Barbara's words had planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over similarities and differences, trying to remember exactly when my son had been conceived and whether the timeline made sense. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to know for sure. I couldn't live with this kind of doubt eating away at me, and I couldn't confront Danielle with accusations based solely on the spiteful words of a woman I'd just rejected. I spent the next few days researching DNA testing options. There were several companies that offered tests you could do at home, with results available in a few weeks. The process seemed straightforward. I finally managed to get the samples I needed and mailed them to the testing company. Then began the longest few weeks of my life. During those weeks, I tried to act completely normal around Danielle and our son. I went to work, helped with homework, and maintained our usual routines. But inside, I was falling apart. Every time I looked at the boy, I wondered if he was really my son. Every time Danielle smiled at me or told me she loved me, I wondered if our entire marriage was built on a lie. Danielle noticed I was quieter than usual and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was just dealing with some stressful situations, which wasn't entirely untrue. The stress of waiting for those test results was affecting every aspect of my life. Finally, on a weekday afternoon, I came home to find an envelope from the DNA testing company in my mailbox. I opened it in my car, not wanting to risk Danielle seeing it if she was home. The results were unambiguous. There was a 0% probability that I was the boy's biological father. I sat in my car in our driveway, reading those words over and over again. Years of bedtime stories, activities, birthday parties, and proud father moments had just been revealed as a complete lie. The child I'd raised as my own, the boy I loved more than anything in the world, was not my son. But even more devastating was what this meant about Danielle. She had gotten pregnant by another man and had let me believe he was mine for years. Every day, she had looked me in the eye and perpetuated this massive deception. I thought about all the times she told her friends how lucky she was to have such a devoted husband and father. I thought about how she'd let me work extra hours to provide for what I thought was my family. I thought about how she'd watched me bond with the child and never once suggested that I might not actually be his father. The betrayal was so complete and so devastating that I couldn't even begin to process it emotionally. I just sat in my car, holding those test results, understanding that my life as I knew it was over. That evening, after the child had gone to bed, I asked Danielle to sit down because I needed to talk to her about something important. She seemed concerned by my serious tone, but settled into her usual chair without suspicion. I told her that Barbara had visited while she was out, and that Barbara had made some disturbing accusations about our marriage. Danielle's face immediately showed anger and confusion, asking what Barbara could possibly have said that would upset me so much, because Barbara has been distant for a while. Instead of explaining Barbara's accusations, I handed Danielle the DNA test results. She looked at the papers for a long moment, clearly trying to understand what she was reading. When the reality of what she was holding hit her, her face went completely white. She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Her first response was to deny everything. She said Barbara's family had always been jealous of our marriage and had probably put her up to making false accusations to destroy our relationship. She suggested that the results might be part of some elaborate scheme. I told Danielle these were official results from a certified laboratory, not something that could be faked. I explained how I'd collected the samples and sent them myself, giving her every detail of the process to make it clear that these results were legitimate. Danielle stared at the papers in her hands, and I could see her mind racing through possible explanations or excuses. Finally, she looked up at me with tears starting to form in her eyes. She asked me how I could have done this behind her back, how I could have doubted our family based on the word of a bitter woman. She said it felt like a violation of trust for me to secretly test the child's DNA without talking to her first. I told her the results spoke for themselves. Either she could explain how I wasn't the boy's biological father, or she needed to stop deflecting and tell me the truth. When she saw she couldn't bend things, that's when Danielle completely broke down. The tears came in full force in a way I'd never seen before. She was shaking and could barely get words out between the crying. Finally, she admitted that she'd made a terrible mistake. She said it happened earlier in our marriage when I was working long hours, and she was feeling lonely and confused. She said she'd had an affair that only lasted a short time, and that she'd ended it as soon as she realized she was pregnant, hoping the baby was mine. I asked her why she'd never told me the truth, especially after the child was born, and she presumably knew he might not be mine. She said she'd convinced herself that I was probably the father, and that telling me about the affair would only hurt our marriage unnecessarily. As the years went by, she said, it became easier to just believe her own lie. She said the boy was clearly my son in every way that mattered, and that she genuinely started to forget about the possibility that someone else might be his biological father. I asked her if she'd ever considered getting a test herself to know for sure. She admitted that the thought had crossed her mind over the years, but that she'd been too scared to find out the truth. She said she'd been terrified of losing everything we'd built together. The worst part of her confession was learning about her motivations for not having more children. Danielle and I had talked about having another baby several times over the years, but she'd always found reasons to postpone it. Now I understood that she'd been afraid to risk having another child who might not maintain the illusion. Sitting there listening to Danielle's confession, I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. This woman whom I'd trusted completely, whom I'd worked so hard to provide for, who I'd loved without reservation, had been living a lie for our entire marriage. Every day for years, she'd let me believe I was the child's father while knowing there was a significant chance I wasn't. I told Danielle I needed time to process what she told me, and that I was going to sleep in the guest room that night. She begged me not to leave, saying we could work through this together, that our family was worth fighting for. But I couldn't even look at her anymore. The betrayal was so complete that I felt like everything I'd believed about my life had been revealed as fiction. I left the house that night and drove around for hours, trying to make sense of what my life had become. When I finally came home, Danielle was still awake, waiting for me. She tried to initiate another conversation about working through our problems, but I told her I wasn't ready to talk and went straight to the guest room. Over the next week, Danielle made constant attempts to repair our relationship. She kept emphasizing that the boy was my son in every way that mattered, that biology didn't change years of love and bonding. Part of me understood what she was trying to say. I did love him, and the idea of losing him was almost as devastating as discovering Danielle's betrayal. But I couldn't separate the love I felt for him from the anger I felt about being deceived. Every time I looked at the boy, I was reminded that Danielle had lied to me for years about the most fundamental aspect of our family. After a week of Danielle's constant pleading and my own sleepless nights, I made the decision that I couldn't continue living this way. The trust that had been the foundation of our marriage was completely destroyed, and I couldn't see any way to rebuild it. I began the divorce process. I knew it would be complicated, but I also knew I couldn't spend the rest of my life living with someone who had deceived me so completely. When Danielle received the divorce papers weeks later, her reaction was immediate and intense. She refused to sign the papers, insisting that we could work through our problems if I would just give her a chance. She suggested counseling, temporary separation, anything other than divorce. She kept repeating that she'd made one mistake years ago and had been a faithful, devoted wife ever since. But I couldn't see it as just one mistake. The affair itself was a betrayal, but the years of deception that followed felt like a betrayal that happened fresh every single day. Every time she told me what a wonderful father I was, every time she'd let me make sacrifices for what I thought was my family, every time she'd watch me bond with a child without telling me the truth, all of those moments felt like individual acts of deception. When it became clear that Danielle wasn't going to cooperate, we had to go through the court system. The process became longer and more complicated, involving legal proceedings about property and support obligations. The most difficult aspect was determining my relationship with the boy. Since I wasn't his biological father, I had a complicated legal standing. Danielle tried to use this as leverage, but I also had the option to legally sever all ties with him, which would eliminate any potential support obligations while also ending any parental rights. It was the most heartbreaking decision I'd ever had to make. I loved him, but I also knew that maintaining a relationship with him would mean maintaining a connection to Danielle and the lie that had defined our marriage. In the end, I decided that a clean break would be better for everyone involved. The entire divorce process took months to complete. Danielle fought every aspect of it, seemingly hoping that dragging out the process would give her time to change my mind. In the final settlement, Danielle received her fair share as my wife and got support to help her transition. I made sure everything was structured to make it clear that I was providing for Danielle as my former wife, not for the child as his father. The divorce was finalized on a cold day several months after I'd first received those DNA test results. I signed the final papers, officially ending the marriage I'd thought would last forever. I never spoke to Danielle again after that day. I kept my wedding ring in a drawer for a few weeks, then eventually threw it away with the rest of the reminders of our life together. The hardest part was not knowing what happened to the child. I thought about him constantly, wondering how he was adjusting to his parents' divorce, whether Danielle had told him any version of the truth about why I'd left, and whether he missed me the way I missed him. But I also knew that reaching out to him would be unfair to everyone involved. He deserved stability and consistency in his life, not the confusion of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who wasn't his father and couldn't be part of his daily life anymore. As for Barbara, I never found out what happened between her and Danielle after everything came to light. I assumed Danielle must have confronted her about revealing the truth about the boy's parentage, but I had no idea whether their friendship survived or whether Barbara felt any remorse for the way she'd chosen to deliver that devastating information. Sometimes I wondered if Barbara had known about the child's parentage all along, or if Danielle had confided in her during one of their many conversations. It was possible that Barbara's decision to reveal the truth had been motivated by spite after I'd rejected her advances, but it was also possible that she genuinely thought I deserved to know. In the end, it didn't matter what Barbara's motivations had been. What mattered was that she'd forced me to confront a truth that had been hidden from me for years, and that truth had revealed the complete breakdown of trust that made my marriage unsustainable. Looking back now, I can see that there were probably signs I could have noticed if I'd been paying attention. Danielle's reluctance to have more children, her occasional nervous reactions when people commented on family resemblances, and her defensive responses whenever anyone made jokes about paternity. But I'd been so confident in our relationship, so sure of Danielle's honesty and commitment, that it never occurred to me to question the fundamental assumptions about our family. I'd trusted completely, and that trust had been systematically betrayed for years. The experience taught me that trust, once broken so completely, can't be repaired through apologies or promises or good intentions. The daily reality of living with someone who had deceived me about something so fundamental felt impossible to overcome, no matter how much history we shared or how much we'd once loved each other. I don't know if I made the right choices during those difficult months. I don't know if there was a way to work through Danielle's betrayal that would have been better for everyone involved, especially for the child. I don't know if I should have tried harder to separate my anger at Danielle from my love for the boy I'd raised as my son. What I do know is that Barbara's unexpected visit that Saturday afternoon changed everything about my life. In the space of a few minutes, she revealed a truth that Danielle had kept hidden for years, and that truth made it impossible for me to continue living the life I thought I knew. Sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives come from the most unexpected sources, delivered by people whose motives we'll never fully understand. Sometimes the truth we need to hear comes from someone whose intentions were far from pure, but whose words force us to confront realities we've been avoiding. I'll never know what my life would have been like if Barbara had never knocked on my door that Saturday, or if she'd chosen to keep Danielle's secret to herself. But I do know that living with the truth, however painful, was better than continuing to live with a lie, however comfortable that lie had been. The foundation of everything I believed about my marriage and family had been destroyed in a single afternoon. But from the destruction of that foundation, I was finally able to start building something real and honest, even if I had to build it completely alone.